Minutes, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, do protests increase the spread of the virus?
Do protests increase the spread of the virus? I think I can make a general statement.
Well, 500,000 protesters on June 6th alone.
Yeah.
I'm just asking that number of people. Does it increase the spread of the virus?
Crowding together, particularly when you're not wearing a mask, contributes to the spread of the virus.
Should we limit the protesting?
I'm not sure what you mean. How do we say limit the protesting?
Should government limit the protesting?
I don't think that's relevant to.
Well, you just said if it increases the spread of the virus, I'm just asking, should we limit it?
Well, I'm not in a position to determine what the government can do in a forceful way.
Well, you make all kinds of recommendations. You make comments on dating, on baseball, on everything you can imagine. I'm just asking you just said that protests increase the spread. I'm just asking you, should we try to limit the protests?
No, I think I would leave that to people who have more of a position to do that. I can tell you.
Government stopping people from going to church, Dr. Fauci.
Yeah.
Last week in the Calvary Chapel case, 5 liberals on the Supreme Court said it was okay for Nevada to limit church services. Justice Gorsuch said it best. He said there's no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel. I'm just asking, is there a world where the Constitution says you can favor one First Amendment liberty, protesting, over another, practicing your faith?
I'm not favoring anybody over anybody. I'm just making a statement that's a broad statement that avoid crowds of any type, no matter where you are, because that leads to the acquisition and transmission. And I don't judge one crowd versus another crowd. When you're in a crowd, particularly if you're not wearing a mask, that increases the spread.
It's a simple question, Doctor. Should we limit the protest? Government is obviously limiting people going to church. And look, there's been no violence that I can see at church. I haven't seen people during a church service go out and harm police officers or burn buildings. But we know that, for 63 days, 9 weeks, it's been happening in Portland.
Right. Yeah.
Well, one night in Chicago, 49 officers were injured, but no limit to protests. But boy, you can't go to church on Sunday.
I don't know how many times I can answer that. I'm not going to opine on limiting anything. I'm just going to tell you.
You've opined on a lot of things, Dr. Fauci.
Yeah, but I've never.
This is something that directly impacts the spread of the virus, and I'm asking your position on the protest.
Yeah, I'm not going to opine on limiting anything. I'm telling you what it is, the danger. And you can make your own conclusion about that. You should stay away from crowds, no matter where the crowds are.
Government has stopped people from going to work. In fact, just in New Jersey 4 days ago, Ian Smith, Frank Trombetta were arrested for trying to operate their business, their gym. They were arrested. But my bet is, if these two individuals who own this gym were outside just in front of their gym, and all the people who were working out in their gym were outside protesting, they'd been just fine. But because they were in the gym working out, actually running their business, they got arrested. You think that's okay?
I'm not going to opine on who gets arrested and who does not. You get where I'm going. I'm telling you, as a public health official, I say crowds.
Do you see the inconsistency, though, Dr. Fauci?
There's no inconsistency, Congressman.
So you're allowed to protest, millions of people on one day in crowds yelling, screaming, but you try to run your business, you get arrested? And if you stood right outside of that same business and protested, you wouldn't get arrested? You don't see an inconsistency there?
I don't understand what you're asking me as a public health official to opine on who should get arrested or not. That's not my position. You could ask me as much as you want.
You've advocated for certain businesses. You've advocated for certain businesses to be shut down. I'm just asking you on your position on the protest. I haven't seen one. We've heard a lot about hair salons. I haven't seen one hairstylist who, between haircuts, goes out and attacks police or sets something on fire. But we've seen all kinds of that stuff during protests, and we know the protests actually increase the spread of the virus. You've said that.
I said crowds. I didn't say specifically. I didn't say protest do anything.
So the protests don't increase the spread of the virus?
I didn't say that. You're putting words in my mouth.
No, I just want an answer to the question. Do the protests increase the spread of the virus?
I don't have any scientific evidence that anything. I can tell you that crowds are known, particularly when you don't have a mask, to increase the acquisition and transmission. No matter what.
So you don't have a position on whether the protests increase the spread of the virus or don't increase the spread of the virus?
I'm saying that crowds, wherever the crowds are, can give you an increased probability that there's going to be acquisition and transmission.
But do you understand Americans' concern? Protesting, particularly according to the Democrats, is just fine, but you can't go to work, you can't go to school, you can't go to church. There's limits placed on all three of those fundamental activities, First Amendment activities, but protesting is just fine.
You know, the gentleman's time has expired, but I'll just ask the gentleman to just think about his question and put it in reference to crowds that gather in political meetings, at fundraisers without masks, on an oil rig in Texas, nobody wearing a mask, nobody social distancing, but a fundraiser. Would that be problematic? With that, I'll yield 5 minutes to Mr. Fauci.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redfield, I'm a scientist as you are, and so you know how important it is that when a great scientific breakthrough reaches the public, that the proper credit is given, not to just those who show up and claim credit at press conferences, but to the long list of federal researchers who made these breakthroughs possible. And also to the enlightened federal employees and the politicians who funded that research. I remember back a few years ago when we had newspaper headlines about all the miraculous cures in cancer immunotherapy, where I gave a floor speech in the U.S. House saying, yeah, this was great, but equally great were the decades of federally funded research and the researchers who made those clinical breakthroughs possible. And also, frankly, that some of the credit goes to the Democratic and Republican members of Congress who resisted the proposals for massive budget cuts to science that were proposed by Republicans for years in the Paul Ryan budgets and by the Trump and Mulvaney budget cuts since then. Now, in the case of the mRNA vaccines that have been so much in the news this week, the story does not start with Operation Warp Speed. It does not even start with a historic 63-day sprint from the publication of the viral genome to the first patient injected by the mRNA test vaccines. The sprint, I believe, began when President Trump, this sprint actually began when President Trump was still ridiculing the idea of the pandemic. The sprint actually started when dedicated employees at NIH and Moderna who understood the danger of COVID-19 and began working day and night. The story of federal investments in mRNA vaccines actually starts, I believe, back in 2009, when President Obama, who was at the time unhappy with the speed of response to the H1N1 swine flu epidemic, convened his scientific advisory panel, PCAST, which they did back in those days, and famously asked them, if you guys are so smart, how come you still make vaccines with chicken eggs? Okay, so 1 year later, in August 2010, PCAST put out a report on re-engineering vaccine production for pandemics, which emphasized the potential of new technologies to make vaccines and therapeutics available far faster in a pandemic. Heeding the advice of his scientific panel, which they did back in those days, in 2013, the Obama administration awarded a $25 million DARPA grant to a startup called Moderna to develop their mRNA vaccine platform for pandemic response. This was followed in 2015 by a $125 million investment by BARDA, so that by the end of the Obama administration, Moderna had mRNA vaccines and therapeutics under test in both animals and humans. So why is it that the Obama administration prioritized mRNA vaccines and therapeutics? Well, first off, it's their speed of development, which we saw realized in the 63-day sprint. It's the speed of manufacture, which has to do with the high yields of in vitro transcription reactions, and their potency. Scientifically, the exciting news of the last few months is that a potent human immune response can come from doses as low as 30 micrograms of mRNA vaccine. So 30 micrograms, what does that mean? What it means is that this 1 liter bottle, if it were full of mRNA vaccine, would contain over 30 million doses. This is enough to vaccinate every one of Americans' doctors and first responders, or all of its seniors over 75 years old. And that is why the Obama administration invested in mRNA vaccines and therapeutics starting back in 2009. And without those investments, frankly, Project Warp Speed would not have squat. Now, Dr. Fauci, would you agree that when there are great medical breakthroughs, that the public needs to be reminded about the long line of federal R&D that's led to vaccine and therapeutic successes that we're anticipating?
Yes, Congressman, and it even goes beyond what you're saying. Everything you say is very well taken. And I think maybe it's a good time to recognize the fact that the generosity of the Congress through multiple administrations, both Democratic and Republican, and whether or not the Congress was controlled by Democrats or Republican, the support for biomedical research that goes back decades, leading to everything that you're talking about, but even before then, some of the monoclonal antibody work, some of the work that's being done with the molecules that are directly antiviral molecules. I think we often forget that when we think of the product, and often forget, as I think you've appropriately pointed out.
Well, what are the
a lot of
scientific
important
investments we should be making now to ensure that we're better prepared for future pandemics? And how can we support those investments with the kind of science budget cuts that we're seeing proposed in the Trump and Mulvaney budgets?
Well, I mean, I hope we don't get cuts, but in fact, we have been very.
But they've been proposed. They've been proposed again and again. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, it looks like my time is up.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, over here. Yeah, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record story from June 5th, 2020, underscoring what Dr. Fauci wouldn't answer today. Dr. Fauci says large protests taking place across the country are a perfect setup for spreading COVID-19. So he said that a month ago, even though he wouldn't say it today. So that's a story from Business Insider, but also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a June 12th story. Dr. Fauci tells ABC Powerhouse Politics that attending rallies, protests, it's risky, even though today his position seems to have changed. Obviously, his position changed on many things, many times over the last several months. But I'd ask to enter those two articles for the record.
I'll yield to Dr. Fauci.
Like I said, any crowd, whether it's a protest, but any crowd in which you have people close together without masks is a risk. And I'll stick by that statement. It's a public health statement. It's not a judgment on why you're there in the crowd. It's a statement related to the fact that you're in a crowd.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Mr. Chairman,
And without
Chairman, I didn't ask him a question, and you let him respond. I was making unanimous consent.
And I'm going to run this meeting.
Well, but I would like a chance to
Just
respond to what
remember,
you said.
I'm going to chair this meeting.
No, I understand
Now,
you're the
without
chair. That's why I
objection-
said, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, your statements, whatever you got there, will be entered into the record. And without objection, in a gathering, whether you're protesting or whether you're politicking, in a gathering would be risky. And that's what the man has said.
Yeah, but that's
And so-
not what's happening. That's my point.
Oh, all of the,
That is
you're
not what's
telling
happening.
me
There are
that
limits. People can't go to church, can't go to
Mr.
work,
Chairman,
can't go
that
to
gentleman's
school.
out of order.
But they can protest
I'm gonna
all
run
they
the meeting.
want.
That goes for the Democrats and Republicans. I'll make the decision as to who is out of order. I'm going to be as gentlemanly as you will allow me to be.
I appreciate
Okay.
it, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. And with that, I'll yield 5 minutes to Mr. Green.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and witnesses for your amazing service to our country. Thank you. First, Dr. Fauci, there was a bit of roar about a picture of you at the Nationals game without your mask on. I think you were seated with your wife. You had a close friend there with no one else nearby you. And that gentleman who was with you had his mask on. I think you have said in the press since that you took it off to take a drink of water. I just want to point out, according to an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I quote, significant exposure to COVID-19 means face-to-face contact within 6 feet with a patient with symptomatic COVID-19 that is sustained for at least a few minutes, and some say more than 10 minutes or even 30 minutes. The chance of catching COVID-19 from a passing interaction in a public space is therefore minimal, end quote. The science seems to be pretty clear. We should absolutely wear masks when we're in close contact with those outside of our household. I think that was just the conclusion of that discussion. It's not a crime to pull your mask off, to take a drink of water in 100-degree temperature when you're seated next to your wife and someone else is there. I guess I make the point to show how the media has created all of this hype, which has led to some officials across the country making decisions that are not based on science. And there are real consequences to those. I mean, if people are hot, they shouldn't get heat stroke and not take their mask off. So I'd like to move on to some other troubling actions that were done this week. This week, the chairman of the committee sent 4 letters, all to Republican governors in red states, demanding extensive documents related to coronavirus response. The White House Coronavirus Task Force report has 21 states listed in the so-called red zone. This isn't about transparency, it's about ridiculing 4 states, including my home state of Tennessee, and it distorts the truth. The letters singled out 4 GOP states, but what about the other 17 states? Why didn't California get included in the letter? They've seen an explosion in positive cases. They're in the spike. They're in the 21 listed red zone states, targeting only Republican governors when clearly 17 other states, many of whom are Democrat, are also experiencing the spikes and in the red zone, shows this effort has nothing to do with getting answers and is, as the chairman has said in his opening comments, politics over science. No scientist who wants the truth samples just Republicans. Honestly, it's a laughable partisan strike. Also compounds the insult to all Americans for the failure of this committee to look at the real culprit. As I said in previous testimony, a Columbia University study showed that 66% of American deaths could have been prevented if China had spoken up 1 week earlier. That's thousands of American lives that could have been saved. So instead of addressing the cause of 66% of our casualties, the Select Committee on the Coronavirus picks on American businesses, the Trump administration, and now 4 state governors, all Republican, when we know other blue states are in the exact same situation. This is the definition of partisanship, but I can hear it now. Didn't the right send a letter to certain governors? And yes, we did. We sent it to every single governor who refused to follow the Trump plan, emphasis on plan, and sent COVID positive patients back to nursing homes, killing patients. We didn't select just a few of those. I applaud Congressman Foster, who